Próba mikrofonu, raz, dwa, raz, dwa. Już sekunda. Daj mi moment, jedną rzecz muszę tylko skończyć, a nie chcę tam jeszcze tutaj wracać. Who were kind to accept our invitation. These are Professor Joel Christensen, Professor Daniel Immerwahr, and Professor Brett Rogers. Thank you very much for this acceptance. Moreover, we'll have the fourth participant, and he is one of our most faithful fans. It is Dr. William Perpetual Bush. So, Let the show begin. I would like to announce Professor Daniel Immerwahr of Northwestern University, who will have a speech entitled Heresies of Dune. Professors, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to, excuse me, attempt an act of technological proficiency and share my screen. Let's hope that goes okay. All right. So I gather most of us know the basic sort of story of Dune. I want to talk about the history of it. And it has an interesting history. It's a very unusual history in terms of its publication. Dune came out, it started publication in 1963 in serial. And when it did, it really didn't have much of a fan base. It took a while for Dune to sell its first thousands of copies. But it eventually did. It caught on and it got a lot of readers. What's surprising, though, is how persistent Dune's readership has been, to the point where not only has the whole series sold by Frank Herbert's death in the 80s, 35 million copies, which is absolutely extraordinary for a literary franchise. But Dune, the first novel, actually topped mass market paperback bestseller list in the United States last year, meaning that it was outselling books that had recently been published, even though it was more than 50 years old. I want to try to account for that, particularly account for why Dune matters a lot today, by talking about the politics in the book and particularly the historical context that produced them. Frank Herbert was politically interesting from the start. His grandparents had founded a socialist commune in Washington state. The commune didn't last very long, but he grew up on the site of that commune. So already he was politically very different from a lot of his compatriots. And he had another thing that made him different, at least different from a lot of white people at the time, which is that he started to get strong relationships with indigenous people, and including when he was a youth, sort of an early teenager. But in his own account, he was semi-adopted for 2 years by a man whom in his biography he referred to as Indian Henry. When I read that, I just assumed that this was possibly an apocryphal figure, but certainly one that would be hard to track. But I actually was able to track and figure out who Indian Henry was. He's a man named Henry Martin, also known as Hondo Shoa, who was a Quileute Indian and lived right in the area that Frank Herbert is describing. Frank Herbert had close connections to indigenous people. I'll talk a little more about them, but he also had imperial connections, and he went into politics. And you might have expected that someone who was socialist raised and sort of partook in at least parts of indigenous life might have found himself on the political left, but that's absolutely not the case. Frank Herbert was a Republican, so the right wing of politics in the United States, and he worked not just as a Republican. He wasn't just a Republican voter. He worked for Republican politicians, particularly for some fairly hard right politicians. This man depicted here, the Senator Guy Cordon, is sort of the right wing of the West Coast Republicans. Was anti-labor, pro-logging, and this on my slide it says anti-communist, but of course I meant anti-communist, and a very strong anti-communist. Frank Herbert was influenced by Guy Cordon enough that his first novel was about Guy Cordon was very interested in not just logging, but oil extraction and imperial oil extraction from off the coast of the United States. And Frank Herbert's first novel was a sort of romantic thriller about the joys of offshore oil drilling. So he had, on the one hand, this sort of investment in conservative politics, and Guy Cordon was important in the management of the United States' overseas colonies, which Frank Herbert was very interested in. On the other hand, he had these attachments to indigenous life, and those attachments were redoubled later in his life, even as he's working for Guy Cordon. His best friend, the godfather of his son, Brian Herbert, was an environmentalist named Howard Hansen. Howard Hansen was a Quileute man who'd grown up on the Quileute reservation, lived there much like Indian Henry or Henry Martin had. And Frank Herbert took this friendship, by all accounts, quite seriously. While he was writing the Dune saga, he paused it sort of between books to write a novel about Quileute life, sort of indigenous life on the west coast of the United States. In some ways, Frank Herbert resembles a number of other important white countercultural figures who were writing in the 1960s and the 1970s, in that they got very interested in Native American life and took a sympathetic interest in it. People like, if you know sort of US scene a little bit, Stuart Brand and Ken Kesey were absolutely central to a lot of the aspects of the counterculture. And both of them were, in fact, they met because they were both so deeply interested in Native life at a time when very few white people were. And in Dune, a lot of what is powerful, and I think initially very seductive to readers about the novel, was how much countercultural stuff it just dropped on its readers. And much of that it associated not just with the sort of outer space milieu, but particularly with Native Americans, or in this case, the transposed Native Americans, the Fremen. I think there's a lot of reason to see the Fremen, despite their Middle Eastern accoutrements, as really based in, for at least Herbert, in a lot of ways, on what he'd known about Native life in the United States. It's the Fremen who take drugs. It's the Fremen who have mystical visions. It's the Fremen who stage orgies. And it's ultimately the Fremen who do the political act that is so central to Dune, which is defying empire. These political tensions that Frank Herbert found himself in between, on the one hand, a fairly right-wing version of conservatism, on the other hand, indigenous-inspired counterculture, played out in his novel. And particularly as he wrote the novel, I was able to use the Frank Herbert papers to look at some early drafts of Dune, the first novel. And when you do that, you can see a sort of political evolution over the course of the novel, particularly with regard to one figure, a figure who is central in the first version of the novel, and is called there Dr. Bryce Kynes. Initially, Kynes, whom you know as Liet Kynes, is an off-world man of science. And he's identified with all the kind of stereotypes of a scientist. He has a mind like a timetable. He doesn't care about culture. He just cares about data. And he's sort of a central figure verging on the hero of the first version of the novel. But as Frank Herbert thought more about that, he changed it. So first he shrank Kynes' role, and then rather than having him be an off-worlder, an expert from outside, he made him half Fremen, and he gave him a sort of blended name. So Liet is his Fremen name, Kynes is his white name, but he is, it turns out in the novel, he becomes Fremen. And then Frank Herbert also did something really important to the character, which is in the draft of the novel that we know, the draft that got published, he killed Liet Kynes in the middle of the novel. And Frank Herbert was insistent that this was the pivotal moment in Dune, was the death of Liet Kynes. And in his interpretation, Liet Kynes represented Western man. So this was Western man dying in the desert. And if you are familiar with that scene in the novel, Liet Kynes dies cursing science and realizing that men of science were wrong, science was wrong. And of course, power passes away from Liet Kynes to Paul Atreides, who leads not by science, not by expertise, but by drug-induced mystical visions. I think it's really easy to see in this way Herbert as right in the middle of the countercultural scene in the United States, particularly the West Coast countercultural scene. And he shares nearly all of the interests of people like Stuart Brand and Ken Kesey and leaders of the counterculture, including Zen, the liberatory possibilities of computers, drugs, and environmentalism. Much of that blends into Dune, or at least the Dune saga, even if not the original Dune novel. But there's a twist, which is that Frank Herbert remains pretty conservative, even as he is a countercultural figure, and even as he's kind of seeding ideas into the counterculture, many of which he got from interaction with indigenous cultures. And his he basically sort of articulates a right-wing version of the counterculture, one that is much more martial, conservative, and libertarian. And this plays out in Dune to some degree, but it becomes much clearer in the other Dune novels that he writes, the 6 ones that he writes, where the story just turns into something very different than I think a lot of readers got out of the initial novel. First of all, just a reminder, the entire world of Dune is set in a deeply hierarchical world, a feudal world. And there are challenges to who rules in Dune, but there are no challenges to feudalism as a system. In fact, Frank Herbert, through one of his heroes, praises feudalism as the best social form for an interstellar civilization because it supplies an ancient human need for hierarchy. This was a theme that Herbert would return to again and again, the need that humans have for hierarchy. Paul Atreides, if you've read past the first novel, has a switch, or Frank Herbert does a switch, where Paul Atreides turns out not to be the hero that he appears to be in the first novel, but he turns out to be a tyrant, and in fact a genocidal tyrant who makes Hitler just look like nothing. That's explicitly said in the novels. And when Frank Herbert was asked about this, he said, "I wrote Dune as a kind of bait and switch. I wanted you to fall in love with Paul Atreides. I gave you little hints that things would go wrong in the first novel, but in the second novel, it just becomes clear what went wrong. And the reason I did this," says Frank Herbert, "is that I wanted you to learn not to follow leaders, not to trust charismatic leaders. And particularly, I wanted readers to learn that so that they would learn not to trust big government." And when he explained what he was thinking of, the figure that he came to again and again as a model for Paul Atreides, and you can actually see some similarities, was John F. Kennedy, the liberal democratic president of the short-lived president of the United States. And for Herbert, at least the way he would explain it in interviews, Kennedy and figures like him, that was the thing to worry about, the kind of big government that they were offering. And it's not just through Paul Atreides and Kennedy that U.S. politics intrude on the world of Dune. In the later novels, it's sort of an ambivalent hero is Leto II, or Leto II, who's Paul Atreides' son. And he's an ambivalent hero because you're invited in through the novels into his dream for managing an interstellar civilization. But the dream is a kind of harsh one. What he decides to do is to first of all, become a sort of half sandworm, which allows him to live for an enormously long time, which then enables him to tyrannize the galaxy for millennia. And the reason he wants to do this is to teach people a lesson their bones would remember. And what's the lesson? It's the same lesson that we've already talked about. Don't trust government. There are a lot of reasons to think that Leto II is based on, or at least is resonant with, a political figure who is really important to Frank Herbert, important because he'd been a political ally of Herbert's from Herbert's days in Republican politics, which is Richard Nixon, the Republican president of the United States. When Herbert would talk about Nixon, he often would say exactly the same stuff he'd said about Leto, which is that Richard Nixon actually did something really good for the United States, which is he taught everyone in the country not to trust government. He was a sort of cautionary figure, but a cautionary figure for whom Herbert had great sympathy. Over the course of the later novels, Herbert's conservatism came out. He speaks in the novels of liberal bigots. In fact, there's a really remarkable scene in one of the later novels where two characters are discussing not politics, they're discussing science, and one of them uses the word liberal in a scientific context that is unrelated to Earth politics or unrelated to any politics, and the other character reacts because these characters have ancestral memories, so they can remember back to Earth of our day, and says, "Ugh, that word liberal that you just said, I'm sorry, I'm just pausing because I'm just reminded of how awful liberals in the United States were in the 1960s and what jerks they were, and how liberalism always led to a form of aristocracy." So it's a very weird, as a literary move, it's a very weird moment in the novel, but I think it's Herbert's caustic politics bleeding onto the page. He finds ways in Dune to sneak in his criticisms of social security, bureaucracy, and taxation of the middle class in order to pay for social programs. And when I say he smuggles these into the Dune novels, I don't just mean by putting them, dressing them up as in some sort of sci-fi garb, but he actually talks about them by, naming them by all those terms. Social security is a problem. Welfare state is against, bureaucracy, etc. Frank Herbert also just starts to become very open about his preference for hierarchy and says in an interview, "I know now that not all humans are created equal." One thing that's interesting about the first Dune novel, one other kind of unexpected political move that it makes, is it puts eugenics front and center in the novel. Paul Atreides is the product of a very long breeding scheme to try to breed, the perfect human or kind of a chosen one. In the first novel, in Dune, Paul and his mother Jessica, in some ways, reject that scheme, at least reject the machinations of the Bene Gesserit. But in later novels, that the scheme is then rekindled, and the various heroes just keep trying to cleanse and improve the Atreides bloodline. The Atreides house motto we discover in one of the later novels, Heretics of Dune, is this: "I must rule with eye and claw, a hawk among lesser birds." And I think you can kind of see in moments like this where Dune, at least in Herbert's mind, was trending. We are really familiar with the notion that the counterculture is a left-wing movement, but I think we are now acquainting ourselves with another latent possibility, something that was always there in the counterculture of the 1960s and the 1970s in the United States, but also globally, which is that the counterculture has right-wing possibilities in it too. And one of the things that Dune does is amplifies a lot of those. It's of course a literary text, and even within the whole group of 6 novels that Frank Herbert wrote, there's contradiction, there's vacillation, there's ambiguity, just in the way that often novels provide those things. So there is a way in which, especially the first Dune novel, leaves open lots of possibilities. There are a lot of political possibilities that are encompassed, that are encouraged, that are amplified, that are explored by the first novel. But I do want to argue that of all the itches that Dune scratches, the longing for liberal democracy is not one of them. This is a world in which liberalism and democracy have basically been abolished along with the computers. As Frank Herbert extrapolates what the Dune universe meant to him through the later novels, you realize that a lot of it was figuring out a kind of right-wing politics that is libertarian, heavily armed, and extremely suspicious of government, and deeply hierarchical and quite violent at the same time. And I think this helps us understand why Dune matters to us as a text. Why Dune is so powerful now. We are in a time of great crisis of liberal politics in the United States, but also globally. And I think as Liberal Project's founder, Dune just seems to make more sense as a vision of the universe. It can be seen as a measure of our discontent. There's strong left-wing investments in Dune, strong right-wing investments on Dune, but I think Dune somehow speaks to the crisis of liberalism today. In the wreckage of 2020 and 2021, we look up and we see Frank Herbert beckoning from the desert. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your speech. As I told you before, we'll have joint discussion after all the speeches. So now I would like to invite Professor Joel Christensen from Brandeis University, who will give us a speech entitled Frank Herbert, Dune and the Problem of Heroes.
Thank you. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and Daniel and Brett for joining me in this particular venture. Like Daniel, I'm going to use technology and share my screen with you, and hopefully it'll work out. All right, so here we go. And let's see if I can get mine up. So I'm particularly happy to be between Daniel and Brett here, because I actually think we could argue my talk is a bridge between the historicized Herbert that we get from Daniel and the analysis of the mythical patterns of tragedy and Dune that Brett will give you. I'm going to talk more about narrative, but I'm going to build, I think, off of Daniel's presentation of the politics of Dune by talking about how myth and narrative patterning work, and some of the more insidious aspects of the so-called heroic pattern and what happens in the reading of Dune. So as many of us who work on Dune or written on it must admit, I think, I grew up reading it just as I grew up listening to and reading to Homer's Iliad. So coming to a perspective of epic and narrative that understands its negative aspects and the way it can shape us is hard, because we are raised, I think, to listen to these narratives almost uncritically, to enjoy them and not think about what they're doing to us. One of the things that's true about the Iliad and Dune and Homeric epic in general is that both of them are smarter than I think many of their audience members are, or at least more clued into the fact that epic narrative and mythical narrative shapes its audiences, and that heroes aren't actually people we should be cheering for. When I teach the Iliad or the Odyssey, one of the things I emphasize from the beginning is that the central protagonists, if we can even call them that, Achilles and Odysseus, are actually terrible human beings who wreak destruction on everybody around them. And we should know this if we listen to epic, right? The beginning of the Iliad, gotta sing the rage of Peleus and Achilles, that ruinous rage that sent myriad Achaeans to their doom, lets us know that Achilles is killing his own people. So a few years back, when I started working on Dune, well, more than a few years, a decade or more now, one of the things that really resonated for me is one of these essential lines from the epic that people remember. No more terrible disaster could befall your people than for them to fall into the hands of the hero. I'm really thankful to Daniel for bringing to the surface the fact that Paul is a trick. Right. And his use, or Herbert's use of Paul as a hero, is different from what we see in, say, other modern mythical narratives like Star Wars, or at least the first version, where we're supposed to be totally on the hero's side. The problem with this narrative, though, is that audiences aren't always in on the trick. And one of the things I want to emphasize today is that the narratives that we delight, that we're filled with all the time, even if they're just entertainment, are doing things to us and reshaping us in powerful ways. And so part of this is a way of rethinking work I've done on Dune. And you'll get some good critique, I think, of my own work from Brett Rogers in his presentation. But part of what I want to do is sort of narrativize and give a autobiographical version of how I've come to view Dune and the work it does differently, and how this vision really resonates with what Daniel said and what I think Brett will too. So I'm going to start by talking about Dune and the heroic tradition, talk a little bit about fantastic narratives and ideology, and then I'll just sort of push through problems with the heroic narrative and say some brief unkind things about Campbell's monomyth that Brett will follow up on and sort of give nuance to. And then I'll talk about some of the challenges of Dune, and I'll have to do less work there, I fear, because Daniel's already set me up for it. So there's a bit of a background to this. Brett Rogers and I have a long history of talking about Dune together. He and Benjamin Stevens had a panel years ago on science fiction in the classics at our annual convention of the Society for Classical Studies. So I wrote an abstract for this talk on Dune and the Iliad in 2010, early 2010. I gave the paper in early 2011. The book that this chapter came out in 2015. And oh, how the world has changed in the intervening years, or at least my perception of it. For me, I've had 3 kids. I lost my father suddenly in the process. I moved across the country and witnessed everything that's happened in the past 3 to 4 years. And the world, well, I mean, we're giving this on a Zoom presentation instead of being together, and who knows what normal will look like. So during all this time, one of my main interests has been in what do we know and think about what the stories we tell do? How do they reflect our world, and how do they reshape us? So when I first started working on Dune and the heroic tradition, part of what I emphasized is how epic and myth and science fiction share a relationship with their audiences. And this relationship is based on the space that they create. Things like Star Wars and ancient Trojan War narratives set things temporally and spatially distanced from the audience, so we can work through difficult ideas in worlds that are similar to our own, but different enough that they're not as harmful. One of the most classic examples of this that I give is from, and it's an older example now, is from the television series Battlestar Galactica. In the third season of that show, there are a couple episodes that ask its audiences, and mostly Western American audiences, to first identify with suicide bombers as we were waging a war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and second, to ask us about what it means to delegalize abortion when the human race is under threat. Now, these are both still hot topic issues, but what science fiction does is it creates this space where we can address difficult issues and really think through the world as we're experiencing it. So science fiction and myth create space outside of time. They collapse time with the audience, and they create this fantasy space where we think we're just sort of engaging in things that aren't real. Right? But the fact is, there is a hard connection between the unreal and the audiences, because it's not just the stories that are being told. It's that blended space between the audience's mind and the story that creates a new reality or a way of thinking about it. Now, I already anticipated one of the commonalities of what I'll think of as literary mythology or mythologized literature, and that's a self-consciousness of the work that it's doing in the world. One of the things that makes epic or novelized epic like Dune effective is, as Daniel said, it's self-consciously saying we're criticizing myth. We're criticizing or undermining the heroic narrative, even while using the same patterns and ideas. Right? And so part of what we see in Dune is that Paul Atreides himself becomes trapped by the system of the story that they've told, the propaganda and the legends that the Bene Gesserit have seeded the world with. And Paul is consciously thinking of himself as someone who's in somebody else's story. He knows it and he can't get out of this. So for me, this is a real reflection of what actually happens in the paradigmatic use of narratives. So we see in the Iliad several times Achilles reflecting on the power of narrative and the fact that he himself is in a story that other people will talk about. Famously in book 19 of the Iliad, when Achilles is supposed to be reconciling with Agamemnon, he says, "I think that the Achaeans will remember our story for a long time," which is the understatement of the ages, right? So people in the epics are constantly talking about the fact that they are in narratives and comparing them to other stories. One that I've been thinking about a lot recently is the Wheel of Time series. And Robert Jordan, who probably needed a couple more editors, hits you over the head with the fact that their characters are constantly comparing their experiences to the stories they've heard, and their experiences are bigger and worse and stranger. And it invites us as an audience, when characters are transparently thinking about what narratives do, to ask us about what they do in the world. And then as a secondary level, what do sophisticated receptions of narratives do when they engage with this process, when they acknowledge that they shape you and that they're part of creating action, not just reflecting on it. So, and again, here's me back to the autobiographical part. Part of what I have been interested in the 10 years since I first wrote the piece on Dune is how narratives themselves are reflective of a sort of collective consciousness. So what I argue in my book on the Odyssey is a shared folk psychology, a sense of not just the way human minds work, but the way that human minds are shaped by storytelling and even hemmed in by stories themselves. So years back when I used to teach myth, I would focus on myth in many different ways, the way I think those of us who do mythography do. I would talk about different patterns of thinking about myth, like psychological or ritual, and less about sort of a overarching theory of myth, which we get if we look outside of narrative studies, and that's myth as discourse. When I think about myth now, it's both myth as a type of language that's immersive and conveys cultural assumptions and beliefs, and myth as specific instantiations of those assumptions and beliefs. And what's critical about understanding this is that when you have a system that instantiates certain ideas and values, even when you tell a story that's critical of them, you're still replicating the values for audiences that may or may not be able to tell the difference between a critical presentation of myth and a positive one. So really effective narratives like Dune to an extent occupy an ambiguous space where audiences who are liberal and conservative can both claim them and say that they're theirs. I think that we can look at bad narrative like Atlas Shrugged or the equivalent that's not so sophisticated and see that that's just propaganda. But Dune, on the other hand, falls somewhere, I think, between the Iliad and Rand. Right. But if we think about myth as discourse, then that means it includes the communication of ideologies, the replication of social structures, as well as metaphysical assumptions about what the nature of the world is. And this is where we can get into spaces where we can really disabuse ourselves of the importance of authorial intention. Two examples I always think of are Frank Herbert claiming that spice is not a metaphor for oil, which just seems nonsense to me that he could claim it, or J.R.R. Tolkien saying that the one ring to rule them all has nothing to do with nuclear weapons. It may not, but the social structures that imagine a single destructive power that motivate his storytelling are common between the world he occupied, his audience's world, and the story he told. So narrative as discourse draws, or my approach to this draws on things like sociology and psychology, and even up to post-structuralism. I think if we look at the way Judith Butler, in talking about gender, draws on Althusser and thinks about interpellation and the way our society and culture is replicated, it can really help us understand narrative. So discourse is conservative yet flexible. But the important thing is that while it's uniform and accepts multiplicity, like our own DNA, it's constantly replicating itself with vestigial structures that in the right circumstances will pop up again, which is why one story that may seem rather innocent can appeal to, neo-Nazis, as well as it can appeal to Occupy Wall Street. So a lot of this draws on research I've done in cognitive science and psychology, and I just given a couple examples here that really across the board shows how our consciousness and our collective consciousness is shaped by narrative itself. So narrative is in a way what motivates the human brain. And in the strongest example of this, and this is in Michael Gonzagana and Joseph Ledoux's work, some people argue that our consciousness emerges from narrative itself. And the most powerful example of this I can see, or I can make, is the connection between autobiographical memory and the ability to encode memories in general. As children develop, their ability to remember things is connected to their ability to put themselves in stories about the world as agents who imply certain assumptions about causality and the relation in the world. And this is just as people acquire language, they're also acquiring story patterns that shape the way they interpret the world. And this is what's important, is that our interpretation of the world, what we judge is happening in the world, is based on the narratives that we've heard. And we replicate them through our assumptions. Excuse me, I've got a little helper joining me. So this is Layla, and she's going to join us for the rest of this presentation. So when it comes to fantastic narrative, one of the things that I find super interesting about thinking about ideology and narrative is that mythologized literature is then a discursive space. It's not just a distant space and time to explore things. It's also a space where discourse is explored and enforced, right? So it's a venue for exploring values, but it's subject to double and triple ideological forces. And what this means is, even if we use the language of heroic narrative in a critical way or complex space, then by deploying that very language, we're giving people the option of selecting the criticized point of view. right? So narrative is like a DNA, it replicates itself. So when we have the outline of dominant ideology, it just sits there and responds to what we've already learned before we have received the complex stories. So this is why if we talk about Dune, if we talk about narrative in general, and we don't think about audiences and reception, we're only getting a little bit of the story. So this comes in part to my obsession with the heroic pattern and the monomyth. And for now, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. But there's lots that's written, and Brett Rogers has done a good job of this on the monomyth in general. And it is a problem in several different ways, but it is, as we know, central to the structure of Dune. And even if critical, it still falls into some basic pitfalls of the monomyth. So one is that the monomyth is not all of myth. When we have just one pattern focused on a single character, we miss out on all the other parts of myth that are important. And so I think a cogent criticism of the monomyth system as it's integrated into Herbert and Star Wars and others is that Campbell and other Western male scholars selected narrative traditions that adhered to what they already knew. This selected data skews the evidence, simplifies to a fault, and actually supercharges all of the parts of myth that are limited. And so a couple things about the heroic myth that I've written about with Sarah Bond, and I'll have a bibliography at the end, is that it always emphasizes the individual over community. It has no space for aging families and taking care of other people. And then most harmfully, it enforces structural norms on sexuality, race, and gender. If you grow up reading Dune and other heroic narratives, you're suffering from sort of the fault of storytelling in the 20th century post the sort of monomyth. And that's that we mistake description of how myth works for prescription in how it should. Audiences can't always tell the difference. And of course, this is a problem that goes back to Plato, right? Are people smart enough to know what an allegory is? And that it perpetuates through double and triple ideological moves, even contested ideas. So turning to Dune, and so I'm sort of turning to wrapping up here. I first read Dune as a kid in rural Maine in the middle of the woods, probably in 5th grade, and I thought it was the greatest thing ever, right? And I've returned to it, and each time I get to it, I cringe more. I found the movie, to be honest, unwatchable for some of these reasons. One of the things that I first resisted in Dune, and that I can't handle to this day, is its heteronormativity. The way that the Baron Harkonnen's character is exemplified through his, pedophilia and his non-heteronormativity. Dune, like Wheel of Time, also essentializes gender, right? Like biological gender is an essential feature of the world that has no flexibility. In addition to this, as Daniel talked about, eugenics are huge here. The very notion of genetic memory, which is, of course, extremely attractive to Dune, right? It makes all of us think, wouldn't it be cool if we could remember the ideas of our ancestor, reifies and essentializes the idea that identity comes from your genes, which is, not very far off from some severe white supremacy, and we really have to think about it. And then other people have written pretty clearly and convincingly, and as Daniel's writing about the problems of colonialism, white saviorism, and settlerism in Dune. It treats the indigenous people in this sort of miraculous way you get from some counterculture in the 60s and 70s, but they're really just instruments for the empire that Paul builds. That's a bit of a extreme view that's contestable. So many people have written about these problems with Dune. I'm just trying to give you an idea of some other people have written about it because I haven't done all of this work myself. Brett Devereaux has on his website several cogent criticisms as well. And at the end, I think Dune does acknowledge that narrative and ideology is a self-fulfilling trap. right? And that's clear all the way through. But even as it acknowledges that trick, it performs it. And by subscribing to Dune and heroizing it our own way, we become part of that self-fulfillment. So again, thinking about the reception instead of the audience. And so this is, as I've already anticipated, part of a larger project about thinking about how myth, epic, and narrative reproduces ideology in unintentional ways. So my work is really, with Dune, is not really about epic. It's really about how narrative functions. And as Brett Rogers, who's going to speak next, and I have talked about before, it may be the case that tragedy is better for Dune as a model than epic. And my work's really been comparative and ahistorical. So I think that Brett's work that he'll draw on, that's available for free online, pirated, does a good job of laying out the tragedy stuff. But I've also done more work on how myth shapes us and how what I think of as toxic heroism is essential to the mythical process. So that puts me at a minute over time. I'm sorry for that. I've put these slides and the work cited on academia.edu if you want to look it up there. And I'll mute now so Layla can make all her noise and stop the share.
Thank you a lot, and thank to your daughter also. And now I would like to introduce Professor Brett Rogers of the University of Puget Sound, who will give us a speech entitled Greek Tragedy and the Problem of the Hero in Frank Herbert's Dune. The stage is yours.
Can you hear me? Can you see my shared screen?
Loud and clear.
All right.
Yeah.
Excellent. Just making sure, because I am a Luddite. I don't know how Joel is able to be a techno hero, an excellent talk giver, and a dad all at once. Although that's been like the last 21 months of the pandemic for me in many ways, but not quite. That was amazing. It is a great honor to, oops, excuse me. I need to fix something real quick. Sorry, folks. Let's hang on a second. Well, sorry, I'm having a little technical problem. Give me 1 second. My apologies. Let's do this one more time. There we go. Now it should be clear. Okay, so I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to join this panel. And this has been really terrific to learn so much more about Daniel and Joel's work in a way that's like really just seems so incredibly rich to me. And I hope that I can contribute to the conversation from the angle of Greek tragedy and then sort of to the problem of the monomyth and what are ways we can possibly even work ourselves out of it if once we identify its sort of techniques and strategies. So just as a friendly reminder, Dune is very much in the air right now in all sorts of ways, right? It's not just the film that has come out now in the past month or so. I think it was the last month or so. I don't know, space and time are really hard for me right now. But also there was a terrific issue of the LA Review of Books from November of last year in which Daniel published a terrific piece on heresies of Dune, as well as a similarly really excellent piece on Dune and climate change in the New York Times. And then I want to start with a piece by my colleague Jordan Carroll, on race consciousness, fascism, and Frank Herbert's Dune. And the essay begins with this terrific three-word sentence, fascists love Dune. And Jordan Carroll in the essay does a really exquisite job of sort of articulating why right-wing white supremacist groups have been particularly attracted to Dune as a text for thinking about ways of mapping out the future or the science fictive future. And Jordan does a good job sort of documenting this, especially in like the interviews with Richard Spencer and people like that. And I just want to point to it because in many ways it raises a basic question about that Daniel, I think, really elegantly articulated for us, which is what is Dune's conservative or sort of alt-right, but in a sense of sort of countercultural right / libertarian politics, right? And in many ways, if we become lovers of Dune, as I imagine many of us who here are, just by virtue of whenever we read it, whether it was in rural Maine in our childhood, or whether it was me only a few years ago when someone challenged me to do it, then that has really important implications for what we do with this narrative. So Dune's heroic entanglements are pretty explicit in the novel, but it's sometimes most useful actually to look at what Frank Herbert's son, has to say in his biography of his father, Dreamer of Dune, that came out almost 20 years ago. And there, Brian Herbert describes the novel, and I'm now realizing that by sharing my screen, I can't read all of my own text, that as a heroic family, like the House Atreides is very explicitly framed as this heroic family, tragically beset and burdened with a curse pronounced on them by Thyestes. And when Brian Herbert sort of teases this out, we start to see that this is meant to be evocative of the House of Atreus myth from Greek myth, or from Greco-Roman myth, right? Which gets us into the sort of initial question about what to do with this. And actually in the novel, in Dune, Paul at this one point says, now Harkonnen shall kill Harkonnen. It actually opens Act 2 of the novel, basically part 2. And it sort of sets us up for this thinking of the novel very explicitly in heroic terms. Now I'm trained as a classicist, and so my question, of course, begins, well, what kind of hero or classical hero, if we're using that as a template, is Paul? Because things change depending on the genre. And I really am grateful for Joel for articulating how awful epic heroes are. They are differently awful than tragic heroes, which are differently awful than lyric heroes, which are differently awful than other genres. And we have to attend to those potential differences carefully, just in case, because it might help us map out either solutions or problems that are lurking if we're then trying to interrogate the hero as a problematic category, which again, we have been invited, as Daniel and Joel have pointed out, to do in this novel, right? That we're not supposed to necessarily accept Paul uncritically as a protagonist. So I've kind of mapped out here, as I do in my 2017 article, all the different genres that the story of the House of Atreus shows up in. Now, Brian Herbert, again in Dreamer of Dune, helpfully points out that actually there's a scene when Liet Kynes says, it is said that in the desert, the possession of water can can inflict a man with fatal carelessness. And so there's this really interesting discussion in Dreamer of Dune where Brian Herbert points out that he says this passage is a crucial passage, and Daniel has already sort of alerted us to the importance of Kynes in the narrative and in the evolution of the narrative, that this is an important reference to Greek hubris, says Brian Herbert, and it was not only a tragedy on an individual and familial scale, but on a societal scale, right? And I'll draw your attention to the word hubris again in a little bit. But all of this is to say, it suggests then that for Herbert, if Brian Herbert is a faithful steward of his father's intent as an author, then we are meant to be reading this as a kind of tragic narrative more than anything else. And so that seems to me at least to be the beginning place for exploring not Dune as an epic or a lyric narrative, but very specifically as functioning within the broader sort of narrative template of tragedy, Greek tragedy. And so there again are my contenders for the House of Atreus myth. Right there, Aeschylus. For those of you who may not know these plays, the works of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and then hundreds of years later, Seneca the Younger. Now, I need to sort of express a note of caution here, and just remind us, is this actually classical? And I'm going to give you a big, horrible paragraph that's probably the single most useful thing I've ever been involved in publishing. It was actually drafted by my academic spouse, Ben Stevens, but I got to edit it and put it into the right place in our essay that we wrote together. So, and Ben and I, in our essay, excuse me for a second, because I'm having trouble being able to read my own stuff. I'm going to change the nature of my share here. I hope that this is still legible to you. Ben and I say in this essay, we therefore believe it is important to acknowledge that in more recent science fiction, as well as other genres, the classics have been transformed into something like reliably esoteric public domain material for popular cultural ironization. In this way, the classics are being made into vivid signifiers neither of the ancient past nor even of professional knowledge of antiquity, but of a present moment, an advanced postmodern moment marked by recomposition of past cultural products that is omnivorous and, from a scholarly perspective, generally uncritical. These classics, as it were, cobbled and stitched together into a new monstrum, constitute an imagistically vivid but ontologically indistinct entry in an advanced postmodern encyclopedism that is, in its own view, not hierarchical, but associative and so willfully apolitical about its cultural recompositions. So that is a very fancy way, I think, for us to say things that look classical may not really be deeply meaningfully classical, and in ways that actually then create problems, especially on a sort of political level. So let me step back and just think about what's the evidence for thinking of this within a kind of classical, heroic, tragic framework. And then I'm going to work this back out to that big picture concern. So in my 2017 essay, I go through lots of different criteria for how would you claim that this thing is doing Greek tragedy. And I try to look at things like significant names and terms, what they denote or what they connote, what they seem to, kinds of correspondences they create between the modern text of Dune and ancient texts, verbal echoes and allusions that there might be between texts, and then trying to think about bigger themes or narrative patterns. I think I was thinking of them at the time as sort of universal criteria with scare quotes around universal, because of course I would argue they're not actually universal, but they seem to be so. Okay, so if we look just at the lexical evidence, the initial conclusions that one can draw, and I'd invite you to read the essay to get to this, is essentially that Dune is a narrative about an old style Greek duke who gains popular favor in a Roman Catholic or Byzantine empire built on a combination of aristocratic, religious, or economic medieval guild interests. Or to use the words of Jones, which is perhaps one of my favorite single sentence summaries of the novel, quote, "What happens in Dune amidst a wealth of future Byzantine court intrigue is that a rich white boy in a clearly recognizable fictional Middle East is adopted by some quasi-Islamic tribesfolk and becomes a version of Muhammad." Now, again, Daniel's arguments or sort of readings about the novel in terms of the Quileutes and sort of thinking about them with respect to the Puget Sound region challenges the Middle Eastern stuff in really interesting ways, but that's at least Jones's perspective on this, okay? Now, sorry, I just sort of ruined my own fun there. So there are verbal echoes also that suggest specific texts may be involved here. For example, in the collected sayings of the Muad'Dib, one of them is that there is no escape, we pay for the violence of our ancestors. And this passage I find is very evocative of a line actually from The Libation Bearers by Aeschylus, which is the second play in the trilogy, the Oresteia. I'm not going to read the whole quote here, but the reason I had that little picture in front of this is that not only is this quote a sort of distillation of the Oresteia's concerns about how violence replicates through dynasty over and over again, but it's also the quote that J.K. Rowling uses as the one of the two epigraphs to Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. And there's a weird way in which actually Aeschylus's Libation Bearers seems like it may be a kind of master text, not just for Dune, but for the Harry Potter series, in a way that suggests that speculative fiction is really preoccupied with the way that the Aeschylus's Oresteia puts dynastic violence on the agenda in the 20th century and early 21st century in modern speculative fiction, in ways that I'm actually thinking about doing as a book project on ghosts of Aeschylus and speculative fiction. But I just want to sort of leave that there as something for you to worry about. Now, there are shared patterns between Dune and the Oresteia, such that if you map out the plot of both novels in pretty reductive terms, they actually seem to follow a pretty similar trajectory. And this was sort of me experimenting with like, wow, Dune's really working the Oresteia in really interesting and sort of surprising ways. Now, you'll see then that I am arguing on some level that if we keep working through the evidence within Dune, the Oresteia weighs heavily, at least on a sort of unconscious level within Frank Herbert's thinking. It's not clear. I haven't been able to get my hands on syllabi from courses that he took at the University of Washington, for example, in the 1940s when he was a student there, or things that I haven't been able to get into his personal collection. So maybe Daniel has some insights on this. But it seems to me that this is a text that he is thinking with more so than other tragic texts, I think. However, pause. I want to point us back to some things that Brian Herbert says about the text's heroic entanglements. Now, remember when Brian Herbert was talking about the heroic family, the House Atreides, he used the phrase was tragically beset by flaws. And then he talked about how this passage was an important reference to Greek hubris, cautioning against pride and excessive confidence. Now, folks who have studied this, the history of how we talk about tragedy, know that this is a way no one talked about tragedy before the 1940s. This is based on a very particular reading of Aristotle's Poetics that was popularized in Anglo-American education and possibly in other educational sort of fields in the 1940s that suggests that what Brian Herbert is not actually giving us sort of what I as a classicist would think of as the classics, but rather this very popular version of how to talk about hubris that is a reduced reading of Aristotle that was popularized in the 40s and starts to become diffuse in popular culture. And I'd point to you in my book, Classical Traditions in Science Fiction, there's an essay by Greg Booker that does a terrific job of talking about this as a way of reading the movie for the Forbidden Planet, which he basically reads as sort of the Freudian reading of Oedipus Tyrannus sort of run crazy as science fiction. Now, the other thing that Brian Herbert talks about is the hero prince on a quest, which of course should start to alert us that if he's talking about quests, he's actually probably thinking with the monomyth. And I am grateful to Joel for getting us to think about how much Dune is not really doing Greek tragedy, but doing hero myth as it was understood by Joseph Campbell in 1948 in his famous book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which subsequent generations have mistaken as a prescriptive text rather than as a descriptive text, and frankly, not a very good descriptive text at that. I'm not going to get into why I have problems with Campbell on multiple levels, although I'd invite you to read my Heroes Unlimited piece that Joel referred to. But for our purposes, I just want to show you how if you map out the plot of Dune, according to the pattern that's mapped out by Campbell. And so the left column here is Dune, the right column here, or excuse me, left column here, middle column is Dune, right column, middle column is Campbell, right column is Dune. I'll get that right someday. Please forgive me. My pandemic baby brain is not great these days. If you look at the way that these two different narratives sort of proceed in sort of overdetermined ways, it becomes really clear that actually Herbert's working very closely with Campbell on his mind. And in fact, if you read Dreamer of Dune, Herbert was deeply moved by the work of Jung. He spends a lot of time in Northern California, I think in the late 1930s and 1940s, really getting into Jungian and Campbellian thought, such that it's pretty clear that Herbert is thinking maybe more with the monomyth than with, say, any particular ancient narrative, right? So he's getting basically a lot of his classics, as it were, through, and the way that heroes are talked about, or classical heroes, through Campbell and through these sort of reduced discussions of what a tragic flaw is, okay? Sort of a popularized version of tragedy. So this is why I draw the conclusion that Dune is a monomythic hero narrative dressed in vaguely tragic buskin, rather than actually being sort of ancient tragedy per se. And this is important because then when we see things like in the collected sayings of the Muad'Dib, claims like greatness is a transitory experience, it is never consistent, it depends upon the myth-making imagination of humankind. The person who experiences greatness must have a feeling for the myth he is in. We have to remind ourselves that this is not really something that is universal as a Campbell wants to, or Campbell's sort of proteges would like us to think, but that humankind is really about a he. It's really about a particular kind of masculinist discourse that's located in questions of rights of manhood or myths of manhood. This is descriptively narrow rather than broader universal. So in many ways, we get this problem that Dune is sort of the narrative of the hero with 1,000 anti-democratic faces. And I think Daniel did a really nice job, I think, setting up, I'm grateful for the work you did so that I can do this in shorthand, right? The Dune is in many ways a deeply traditional text that is not interested in democracy, but reifies narrow lines of available rulers and is much more concerned with the threat of, say, religious empire, hence the concerns about like the Butlerian jihad in the novel. I'll just note that, Paul, as the Kwisatz Haderach, is a male usurpation of female prophetic voice. And if you do readings of the Oresteia and Dune together, and where both texts fail, for example, for women, it's really interesting to see that they very closely align on a number of different points. So in many ways, I kind of walk away from Dune as a text about a troubling hero, right? That it's a science fictive text that speculates about a future much like the past of the ancient Oresteia, upholding a traditional view of society in which young males, amidst contested claims to dynastic succession, undergo rites of passage as a form of learning, reappropriate the traditionally female domain of prophecy, and commit violent acts of revenge, all in order to affirm one's claim to sole dominion over the polity. So my question then is, where do we go from here? Are there other paths that we might use for heroes? And I'm going to use this in my last minute to wrap up here. One way that we might think about this is what happens if we sort of defeudalize a Dune type of narrative, right? Can we do that kind of work without necessarily being stuck with that kind of medieval fiefdom thinking? We have to also, though, we can't just get rid of that, right? It's not just an economic or social dislocation. We have to challenge the way Dune thinks about education, especially with the problems that emerge later in Children of Dune. And again, thank you, Daniel, for pointing to Leto II as the charming worm that he is. We have to think about whether or not it's possible to relocate Dune positively in a democratic context, although the reading with the Oresteia is productive because actually the Oresteia suggests that's not possible since it ends with at least an illusion of relocating it in a democratic context. We have the question about whether or not we need to render jihad uninevitable. And actually, I wonder whether we might turn to narrative patterns, for example, from the Quileute Nation, as a way to sort of challenge what other critics have read as the kind of Islamic jihadist reading of the novel and where it's going, right? So that we have to see the Fremen as a kind of hybrid of both cultures, but unfortunately the militarism is the strong part there. We also have to think about getting rid of its structural components, its syntax. We have to, if we can think about the monomyth as a formula for crud, as it were, as Spinrad argued at one point, how do we maybe get away from is there a way to read Dune positively as a critique of the monomyth as a masturbatory power fantasy? Again, that's an argument made by Spinrad. And then also, can we do different things with female characters? Say, for example, Aaliyah and Jessica, who of course I haven't really talked about, but are also heroes in different ways in the novel. And I want to leave you with this slide, which is my favorite thing that was cut from an essay I wrote, which is there's this terrific book by Victoria Schmidt called Story Structure Architect, which is about trying to develop different typologies for different narratives. And in the book, she's got a really great critique of Campbell's monomyth. And she starts to experiment with different ways of thinking about gender and how they get narrated through narratives. Or excuse me, narrated through sort of these kinds of quest narratives or these different pathways. And maybe a different way to put this is that the problem here is not that there's syntax, right? It's not that there's a story. It's that the story is overdetermined and it precludes certain kinds of people. And Dune has clearly been important for a lot of people, as I think all of our talks have demonstrated, because it also raises sort of different pathways and possibilities, right? That it's a critique of the overdetermination of that, but it also suggests there are other possibilities that might exist. And so I just want to sort of invite us to think about, can we jigger the syntax or the narrative to make these work differently, to produce things that we can actually do positively. So I'll say thank you, and that's my shtick.
Thank you so much. And now I would like to invite William Perpetual-Bush, on whom I have focused our view now, Dr. William Perpetual-Bush from the Federal University of Parana, who is going to present a speech, The Religion of Dune, Intersections Between Webers and Durkheims. Here you go.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. I love this event, second time here, and the selection of this group to talk about Dune was just amazing. I'm going to start showing the presentation. When everyone is watching, is seeing, right? Okay. When I'm trying to discuss religion in Dune, my point first is to think what Dune we are talking about, because we have the books, we have video games, we have movies, we have non-movies that never happen, but sometimes we don't take in consideration that they are different and they demand different kinds of analysis, they demand different kinds of approach. By saying this, what I took as a point, right? Dune, as the book from 65, Dune Messiah from 69, and Children of Dune from 76. By selecting these, I had something in mind, because what I wanted to understand at first was, well, how science fiction was dealing with religion. And did Dune broke with the rest of the tradition, or did Dune kept the tradition? For example, also, it's important to consider that this medium, that Dune didn't start as a book. Dune start as short stories. And what you get published is something, what you don't get published is another thing. If you take the two parts of the Dune story that are published at Analog, and at the time, John W. Campbell was the editor, not confuse it with Joseph Campbell, you can see the model of the hero and the monomyth, and the hero is there. The hero exists. However, the part of the material that we see in Dune Messiah, Campbell decided not to publish. Herbert himself went to Galaxy magazine, and it was in Galaxy that he actually managed to publish the material. So first, we are seeing the material appearing in magazines. And the final part, Children of Dune, did actually appear in Analog, but Campbell had died 5 years before. So Herbert could publish it there. So I think if we consider religion in Dune, the first thing we need to make clear is, well, there is this context of the decadence of the magazines, the change to books, and how magazines are controlled, and how this control was questioned, and how this control changed. By saying this, I point out that, well, Herbert did agree with some of Campbell's ideas, but he also broke with many others. For example, how science fiction treated religion. Let's take, for example, Asimov history, Nightfall, 41. it's a classic example of how religion is either using wrong information, wrong data, or it's making the scientific research difficult to be done. You see this in Asimov, but if you pretty much look to the science fiction from the 20s to early 50s, this idea is frequent. But it's not something disconnected from the rest. You need a set of ideas. Not only you see religion as a problem, but you create a hero that is a scientist. So science and religion are on opposite sides. And society and culture are subjected to notions of evolution, determination, that are pretty much social theory from 100 years before. So this is the space of how religion was being treated when Herbert's work was appearing. But then I start thinking, how can I talk about religion in his work without making myself subjected to sets of representations like, oh my God, he's talking about Islam. Oh my God, he's talking about Buddhism. Oh my God, he's talking about Christianity. So I took a step back and I went to Emil Durkheim's theory, social theory. Most important, how Durkheim exposes the dynamics between the sacred and the profane. And when you look at that dynamic, you have one side things that are profane, things that are from the common world, and in the other things are sacred. You don't touch things that are sacred. There are necessary rites that you should follow to touch the sacred, and there's also sets of rites that you need to perform after touching the sacred. So you need to follow this set of rules. And by taking this into consideration, what did I got? Let's take the case of that we are talking about, Jessica, for example. Her first ritual fault, let's say, the first time that she didn't respect how she should handle the sacred, it's when she decided to give birth to a male child. And by doing so, she broke with what the Bene Gesserit wanted. And the Bene Gesserit can be seen as an organized religion. This break, despite the fact that, well, monomyth theory gonna say, well, Paul went to the Gonja bar and he passed this rite of initiation. The thing is, he didn't pass because he didn't ingress into the Galactic Society. Quite the contrary, despite passing the Gonja bar, Paul is not recognized as the Quiz of Haderach. So, by not handling correct the sacred, by Jessica not handling correct the sacred, you see the effects on Paul. Another case is the ritual when Jessica becomes the Reverend Mother. Because in one side, she did follow the ritual to the letter, and she transmuted the water as the water of life as a sacred thing. The sacred is also dangerous, and in this case, it's a poison. So she transmutated it. However, she did a violation of the ritual by being pregnant. So she broke with the rules of how to deal with the sacred. And once again, it is not her that will pay the price. It's her daughter, Alia. By saying this, what can we see? Let's go to the case of Paul. Paul is inserted as a Kwisatz Haderach, but he is not recognized by the Bene Gesserit as such. However, when he got in touch with the Fremen, the sacred for the Fremen is way more fluid. It's not hierarchical and closed as the Bene Gesserit. And this sort of opening allows him to, and mostly because the works that Liet did before him, allows him to insert himself into the culture of the Fremen. And his insertion into the Fremen culture was also an insertion within the Fremen religion. They aren't dissociated. So when you look at this, you can see the role set of rituals that fits the monument. But they are just a part of it. They're not the whole. However, when you look at his figure as emperor, we can see how he treated his marriage with the princess Irulan as something that, I'm marrying her, but it's just status. So he's breaking with the sacred that is inherent with marriage. And it's also the main point where his government starts to downfall by not respecting the sacred for the Galactic Society. His last movement is becoming the preacher, which, if we take Max Weber's theory, the figure of the preacher or the prophet is the one who questions the hierarchy of society. And that's going to be his role in the third book. Now, the case that I want to talk about is how Alia emerged as another implication of not following the sacred. Because when Jessica performed the ritual of life and became a Reverend Mother, she was pregnant. When Alia was born, she immediately excluded from Fremen society, but she also don't have a role in the Galactic Society. After Paul's downfall, she gained control of Fremen society and then the empire itself, as she served the role of the Bene Gesserit that once served. She controls the hierarchy, she controls the religion. The last point is how the final movement, as done by Leto. Because we are seeing a chain of events where the sacred is not respected. And by not respecting the sacred, you're undermining the society. By the time we arrive at Leto, we can see that he is the true Kwisatz Haderach. Not only this, because his father didn't foresee his birth, he also chose to take the golden path. He chose to follow something that his father didn't, which is becoming an hybrid of human and sandworm. And this hybridization that Leto went to is significant because at this moment, the whole set of sacred categories and profane categories are overridden. So we have the God Emperor, which, if you take the two terms, if you join the two terms, you can see that this God Emperor destructs, implodes the old system, and there is a goal in his actions. Is that, well, I'm doing this insane government to protect humanity, both from stagnation in one side, and in another side, to protect humanity from chaos. It's interesting. Also, by doing this, by becoming this hybrid of war and man, he makes it impossible for the future to be predicted or determined. So it's the only way for humanity to actually be free and not manipulated by other types of figures, future Quizet Haderach or something of the sorts. So by returning to what I was saying about thinking the place of Herbert inside the history of science fiction, and not only agreeing or disagreeing with the material, first, well, you see the model of the hero in Poe, okay, but actually Herbert is also saying the golden age hero of science fiction failed. Not only this, but Campbell, John W. Campbell, saw that, and that is why he chose not to publish Dune Messiah. The second thing is, Herbert is critic of the notion that history and society can be determined. The whole point of becoming the God Emperor is opposed to a view that we can find, for example, in the Asimov's Foundation series, where there's a society that can be determined and the evolution can be determined and controlled. This type of thing, Herbert is refusing. Also, Herbert is criticizing the notion that religion is false. That notion that is present in science fiction at the time. For example, if you take the feminine religion and culture, there are a set of forms of knowledge that are fundamental to maintain the ecosystem of Arrakis. So this notion of the importance of the native knowledge to maintain the ecology of a place, it's pretty much trending from Herbert to today. How you need to do is all what the people in Amazonia are doing. Also, the final point is that Herbert constantly works between trying to find a balance between the role of society and how society controls
the organization of this wonderful event for everyone accept
do certain types and in the agency of the individuals can break with it. Oh, that is it. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank everybody. Thank for every speaker for their performance. And now we'll have some time for discussion. I'm sorry, but I have a cat who is interrupting me. for the discussion. So, as I promised, do you have any questions to each of you for any other, or should I read some questions from our chat? Brett?
Yeah, first of all, I just want to say thank you. Is it pronounced William? I just want to make sure I'm getting names pronounced correctly.
Yeah.
I want to first of all thank you for that really stimulating talk. And it's just a cool way of approaching the text. I guess my one question is, one of the premises of the first part of your talk that I'm not quite sure I'm like buying, but I'm like trying to wrap my head around it, is the desire to work back towards the sacred and the profane. And the reason I want to raise this is, you know, in the novel, at least in Dune, there's that moment where Paul recognizes that the Bene Gesserit is not actually a religious order, but that their domain is politics, right? And so like, whereas the guild is mathematics, the Bene Gesserit are politics. And so I'm just wondering about what do you make of, like, that seems to interrogate whether the sacred or profane are really at stake, like whether religion is really religious in the novel. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Thank you so much for this question. That is why I went to Durkheim's theory, because in elementary forms of religious life, basically he's saying, before we can actually get knowledge or form a society, we need to define what is sacred and what is profane. And it's this division that sets how politics gonna work, science is gonna work. It's like the most basis of our understanding of the world. So it's true, the Bene Gesserit is not a religious order in the sense that they establish a church, but religion in Herbert work is pretty much messed up, like the Orange Bible or the Buddhist Islam. But that is why I went to Durkheim. Durkheim is saying, oh, the main basis of religion and knowledge is this division between what is sacred and what is profane. Or let's take a step further. What kind of scientific knowledge is true and what kind of scientific knowledge is false? How we form our representations of the world, how we see the world, are replicated, and they are outside of us and are replicated by us. This is why, true, for the book, they are different. But in a theoretical sense, their basis is the same. Not sure if I answered it.
Anybody else?
I think if there are questions from the audience, we'd be happy to take them.
Okay, so in the order of your speeches, but William, may I ask you to stop sharing the screen? Okay, thank you. Okay, so first question to Daniel. I've got 4 of them. I will put it in the chat disconnected with this. We spoke previously about religion. Here you go. Could you please read it loud and try to answer?
What was the influence of theocracy, which was the effect of the Fremen's revolution under the command of Muad'Dib on the Galactic Imperium? Yeah, I'm not sure I totally understand the stakes of the question, nor am I sure that I have a great answer. I mean, my sense, and I'm very happy to be corrected or have this elaborated by those who know more, is that part of the fear that Herbert is trying to elicit, he has in Dune, he has these sort of brief premonitory flashes where Paul seems like he's, as a kind of white savior figure as he's defeating the Galactic Empire, and that's a good thing. And then you just get these flashes of something very bad happening. And that's, of course, extrapolated in later novels. But my sense is that something very bad happening has to do with the idea that Paul has gone from being a local religious insurgent leader to being a theocrat, right? And that a lot of what is wrong is when jihad gets too large and becomes theocracy sort of fully blown out. That's my sense of it, but others might have different. It's not a topic I feel like I have any great depth of opinion on.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, we are unable to speak with our audience, so we cannot ask about their impressions. The next question is for Joel. May I ask you also to read it and answer?
Absolutely. So the question, how would you assess a metaphorical understanding of an access to spice as an access to knowledge technology? I think this is a great question, and I'm going to take the metaphor in a couple directions. I think it's about scarcity of resources and how we distribute them. So at the core, if you read the Dune narrative in the later books, the way Leto rules and ruins the universe is by creating a unique monopoly on the spice, right? So the spice it's about transferring through space and time, but it's also about knowledge into the past. So it is the ultimate sort of good, right? It represents food, it represents knowledge, it represents uniting the past. And it's about, I think, if we want to go sort of Daniel's imperial direction, it's about controlling everything, right? The ultimate power in the universe controls knowledge, controls space and time. And this is, I think, on the other side, and I'd like to hear Daniel add to this from the indigenous perspective, is this romanticization of the indigenous person as somehow having the special access to knowledge and mysticism. And so we get this, I think, almost toxic union between mysticism and capitalism that then becomes sort of an eternal monopoly. And so I think you can move it to various types of items, but at the core, it's technology as well as basic foodstuffs.
Great, thank you. Of course, if anybody else would like to say something about the question, you are more than welcome for that.
I would just add that I 100% agree with Joel.
Will, you have muted yourself? Okay.
The thing about spice is that Leto endgame is to free humanity from its vice with the spice. His endgame is a sort of, well, we don't need the spice to become special. And for me, this is has a strict relation with how the science fiction fans and writers of the 30s and the 40s create themselves communities and saw themselves as special, or they call themselves Fenzar's lands, that they have some sort of extrasensory power. That the thing is that they want to be better than others. And in this sense, by removing the necessity of spice, by removing this notion that there's just a few people that can be better, but no, everyone is equal. Herbert is also breaking with the tradition of science fiction.
Pardon. Thank you a lot. Now another one goes to Brett.
See, Brett, you focused on the possible ancient sources concerning mostly House Atreides, but how about House Carino, who for years had ruled the universe? Can you find any inspirations for how it was shaped by Herbert? I honestly, off the top of my head, cannot remember any of the information on House Carino, so I'd have to go back and reread things. By the way, I would just want to sort of say, and this is by way of dodging the question, I'm really grateful to Will for reminding us how massive this is as a kind of mega text, right? In terms of different, like, you have a huge book series, you have a book series then elaborated on by Kevin Anderson and Brian Herbert, et cetera. You have film, you have video games, you have other offshoots. And just to be really clear, all of my comments are about the first novel and barely past that. So I'm actually not a sort of Dune fan, but it looks like Daniel has a better answer than I do.
No, I have a question, which is, I mean, I feel like we've all been talking about Dune, and the word Dune can mean two things, right? It can mean the novel called Dune, or it can mean, Brett, what you just called it, this mega text. And I'm a historian. Textual analysis is well beyond my skill set. But I've wondered how to respond to that and how to deal with. I mean, I'll confess I haven't read the Anderson and Herbert kind of extended Duneverse. But I've been unsure what to make of just even the sequels that Frank Herbert wrote, in that, on the one hand, they seem like a clear extrapolation and development of what he was thinking on Dune. On the other hand, they're so confusing from the perspective of a lot of readers of Dune, because they don't do the message that they insist on for Dune is not the message that a lot of readers took from Dune. I guess this gets to Joel's kind of insistence on audience reception. So I just want to put that out there as something that confused me as a writer and a researcher. And if anyone had thoughts, and I'd really love to hear them.
I mean, if the others don't mind, I think, and I'm sure Brett has something to say about this, but really Dune Messiah and Children of Dune, complete narrative arcs that are essential to the tragic plots that Brett talks about. And I think and they were planned together. And I think it's interesting to compare the success of Dune to the lesser success of the sequels. And because it gets weirder and weirder, to the point where, I don't know if you guys have read to the final ones, but you find out, the Tleilaxu tanks are lobotomized women who are creating spice with their bodies. And at the end, there's this really weird turn I don't know what to make of, where you get cloistered Jewish communities who are brought in. And then like the power of love is like magical. And so it takes this really weird arc that almost makes you want to deny the rest. So I would say, like, take the first triptych together, and then God Emperor as sort of a fascinating coda is sort of the way I approach it.
If I can just add one little other piece to this, part of what to me is really productive about this panel together is extrapolating that we're seeing a lot of the problems that happen in myth more broadly, right? And so if we're trying to think about, like, how do mythic narratives go from singular performances to larger and larger texts, and then grow so far beyond the control of the original performer, and then sort of step away from it over, tens, hundreds, thousands of years. And I, in many ways, as a person who really, I'm trained as a classics guy, like Joel and I are like old school Homer tragedy guys, right? Like I think we're both in this because we just like to read Homer. But in many ways, this is a really great opportunity to watch the process historically in real time, how things go from a performance to this other kind of beast, and the different complexities that are built or sort of accrete with the tradition as it moves from, publication in analog magazine to mega text that's so out of control that but like people get really mad about, right? Think about like how people have been responding to the Denis Villeneuve film, and like, millions of dollars being spent, and so much online love and animosity and energy. And it's just incredible to think about like the work myth does, which is why I'm also concerned about pushing back against the Campbellian model, which dominates a lot of thinking, because this helps us see how things actually work, rather than merely arguing there's a collective unconscious, kind of the Jungian move. And then we just sort of, we ignore the details at our peril. So.
Thank you. And next question goes to William.
How would you interpret the act of breaking the rules of a ritual as a fully implemented it? In other words, could we see the breaking of the religious rules as the only way to fully embody in the world of realness, the world is studied symbolic world represented as a set of ritualistic groups? Yeah, before I answer that, which is a very good question, I want to point out that when we take Dune as a text, we must not forget that they are not material that was written to last long, like Dostoevsky or Tolstoy. They are pretty much stuff to sell in magazines, and the notion that the text would later become books are not set. If you take Herbert work, for example, Herbert from Scientology, he wrote a lot, but he wrote just to pay his bills. And what is the problem in it? Is that sometimes we use, we forget that these texts are made for magazines, and the authors didn't foresaw what they are actually doing. So I'm never surprised when things take a very weird turn. I also make a lot of jokes like science fiction is fun fiction, because like, well, and that is pretty much it. For the question, yeah, that is the thing. Society as a group, you need to set and follow the rules of what is sacred and what is not. If you break with something that is sacred, there is a price to pay. For example, we as Westerners take, oh, the life is sacred, so don't go outside and murder people. If you do, it's gonna be a problem. Does it necessarily change life? No, but it's a way of how we think about it. And when we are discussing alien societies and stuff like that, we must always keep in mind what kind of things that we treat as sacred, but they are somewhat invisible to us. Like, oh, privacy is sacred for the Westerners. And we don't really question it. And the power of science fiction, and what Darko Suvin would say, the capacity of estrangement, is how it can show to us what is sacred and what is in plain sight, and we can't see. And it questions it. It questions gender, it questions sexuality, it questions politics, and this is the role of science fiction. Not sure if I answered.
Thank you. I believe we will have a time for the round 2 of this question from the audience. So, Daniel, the second question for you.
Could we possibly draw the comparison between spice and psilocybin mushrooms as a way to turn the social thinking into the more environmental perspective? Yeah, Frank Herbert did not do psychedelic mushrooms, but he did take peyote once, and then he had another drug experience of a more minor sort in Mexico with hashish. And I mean, he was not a frequent user of drugs, but those two experiences were important to him. And so Joel has pointed out that spice seems obviously a metaphor for oil, and later in his life, Herbert kind of admitted that as much. But it's also clear that spice is a sort of reference to mind-altering drugs. And I think that's one of the, I mean, I don't know if that counts as environmentalism, but it's certainly part of a whole package of goods that Frank Herbert was bringing that were pretty far from the cultural mainstream when he started publishing in 1963. and became much more common into the mainstream later. So yeah, thanks for drawing our attention to that. That is an important connection.
Thank you. And the second for Joel.
All right, let me read and process at the same time. Of course, all the characters are presented in Dune in a multi-dimensional way, and it's hard to say unambiguously who is really good and who is really bad. Thus, can you find any example of a hero in the positive meaning of the word in the entire Dune saga? I actually think I can. So I'll pick out two. There's a weird obsession with Duncan Idaho over all the books. Like he just keeps coming back, right? And I think Stilgar is pretty strongly presented all the way throughout. Yeah, as William says, the worms are the best. And I'm forgetting her name, but the descendant of Paul Atreides, the woman who's sort of a primary character who kills Leto in God Emperor. She always strikes me as someone who's sort of evenly shown as a hero or of good quality. So I think I'd be interested to think of the assistants, that level of like, the mentats, the swordsmen, the people who help Dune. It's interesting to think of them as, from myth, as maybe they are sort of divine figures, helpers, like Athena is for heroes in the Greek tradition. So I think those characters, especially Duncan Idaho, I still haven't quite figured out why he keeps getting reincarnated, and I'd be interested to see if Brett, who's probably thought about this, has any thought. You don't? Okay, I won't put you on the spot then.
Brett?
Can I just add one thing though? Is that what I really like about this question is the reminder that even that idea about what constitutes the hero is really modern and has a sort of moral flavor that is different than what the different kinds of typologies that Herbert also seems to be thinking about is. Again, sort of like the humorist who lives in my brain thinks about how a better way to talk about heroes is disastrous celebrity with sort of quasi-noumenal power in an ancient Greek perspective, where, like a lot of, heroes famously are heroes for destroying things, not because they're forces of good. And I like that in many ways, I like that Dune, because of its sort of broad cast of characters, gives us lots of different kinds of representations of the hero, as it were, right? So another way we could kind of frame this entire panel is like, could we march through the books and think about a massive typology of different claims being made about what even constitutes a hero and according to what disciplinary perspectives or worldviews? So.
Great, thank you. And now, second question for you.
Well, goodness. See, Brett. By the way, I assume that Brett 2 is not for my clone after I'm assassinated, or the Duncan Idaho. Why the authors so often model their fiction on the myths, and why mythical tropes fit so well to every plot. The short answer is, when one or two people do it and it sells really well, everybody thinks it's the way to do it. And so the reason I wrote my Heroes Unlimited piece, which if you're looking for something to read, you can find it on my academia.edu web page, is because really my sort of conspiracy theory of the late 20th century is the reason that every superhero story sucks is because George Lucas either uses Campbell to write Star Wars or pretends to use Campbell to write Star Wars. And my brother and I actually have a long-standing debate about where's evidence that Lucas actually did it, as opposed to claiming to do it in order to have street cred with the sort of auteur film crew that's actually who he's hanging out with. Like, as a reminder, George Lucas is an experimental filmmaker. He's not a popular filmmaker, and he's buddies with Francis Ford Coppola. He's, a friend of mine once wrote an article in 2006. The author is named Aidan Wasley, and the article referred to Star Wars as the best postmodern experimentalist art film ever. And so the reason I'm raising this is to say, The problem of someone like a Frank Herbert or George Lucas is that they've convinced us that certain typologies are what make things successful, and not that they're particular theories that are amenable to particular worldviews. So we confuse our readings of them descriptively as, say, scholars, as prescriptions for how to make a successful film. And if you notice, there was a name, Christopher Vogler, that kept popping up in my slides. Christopher Vogler is the guy who turned Campbell's monomyth into a template for screenwriters, such that now people who go to like get MFAs in screenwriting will treat that as a series of templates for producing narrative, which then means people write a lot of scripts that keep doing the same thing over and over again. When I wrote the piece in 2009, 2011, that was an obvious problem in superhero narrative. I'm a little grateful for our sort of Disney Plusified WandaVision Loki world, where that may be starting to come apart in some really productive ways. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'm afraid we are a bit in a hurry, but I would like to put the last question to William, and here it goes.
While presenting the social roles Paul play, you didn't mention anything about being the father, not being strictly speaking. Why? The thing about Paul and his relation with his father is that there is no development in Dune of his father. We know that his father did something and is recognized and even a threat to the Padishah emperor, and even someone that could even take control of the throne. But the first thing that Herbert did is kill the father. For the father, nothing. And this allows a development of the story that is not fixed in being the father figure. And at the same time, when Paul himself became a father, his first kid died, is killed by the Harkonnen, and the twins, what he does, he abandons them to become the preacher. So another important thing in Dune is that it's not, it doesn't depend on the figure of the father as a family. And when it does, for example, when Paul marries Irulan because he can marry her because he is Atreides, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because the title that came from his father doesn't mean nothing. So this is why the father is something that I didn't look as central or important.
Okay, thank you for the answer. Well, I have some more questions, but unfortunately we should have finished 4 minutes ago. So once more, thank you guys a lot for giving these brilliant speeches and for the discussion, and hope to see you during the next edition. All the best, take care.